Okay, well, if you don't know me, I direct the horticulture program at Strawberry Bank Museum here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And we concentrate mostly on 4+ centuries of early American agriculture, certainly herbalism, garden design, quite a lot of themes going through our 4+ centuries of different gardens. This is actually the herb garden. Absolutely beautiful with quite a lot of diversity. And coming up, I'll show you a bit of a 2D design of this. And we'll certainly talk about several plants in here, including Joe Pyeweed to the left there, and a few others. That's mountain mint just below. Lots of diversity. And we are so excited for a lot of those perennials to come up very soon. So we do source quite a bit of primary sources when we are designing our historical gardens, really strict when it comes to period design sometimes, but our modern gardens kind of have a lot more flexibility, but we do go back to all sorts of different sources quite a bit when we are designing some of these strict designs, like Goodwin Garden, which is 19th century, or our Sherburne Garden dating around 1695. But certainly a lot more flexibility when it comes to more modern designs. Now I'm going to just dive right in. If you're looking for seed sources, during our whole COVID challenge, we've noticed quite a lot of limitations online because people are spending more time at home, gardening more. So certainly grab some seed sources as soon as possible, because a lot of people are buying these resources online, if not sourcing live plants as well. But these are several companies that we utilize, whether to reestablish some new heirlooms throughout our designs, or support our seed library, sustaining our gardens, and certainly sharing lots of heirloom seed with the community. So give those a try. Probably the closest locally sourced seed is High Mowing out of Vermont. That's a good one, and certainly Johnny's up in Maine. Now, seasonality and planting charts. Now, seasonality basically allows you to have a vision on when you're planting and when you're harvesting. So to get really a full season for succession plantings, which could be the same thing over and over again, like let's say lettuces, we plant 1 week, we plant the same variety 2 weeks later. So when we're eating that first crop, we're growing another crop. So we're always kind of successioning these plantings. So we're eating continuously all the way sometimes to the winter. You can find a few of these types of charts online. A lot of it comes out of Massachusetts. This is UMass Extension to the left. And I found this other one to the right here, which actually goes into some aquaculture and mushrooms as well, if you're interested. But a different calendar allowing you to kind of focus on spring crops, summer crops, fall crops, and sometimes, if you can get away with it, very early winter crops. Like really hardy winter squash. We grow Blue Hubbard, for instance. That's a good one in this area if you like soups. Turnips will go into the winter, radishes, and certainly lettuces sometimes. You can use row covers sometimes to really extend the season, and that's pretty much this cloth material that you can actually put over some of those crops if you don't have access to a greenhouse. And it's basically a blanket for your plants that still allows light to penetrate. And you can certainly use row covers like that. One of the names is Remay for pest management as well, just creating barriers for your crops. Now, the right plant for the right place is what we often say in the industry. And that basically means selecting particular crops for the environment that you have access to. So if you have a lot of shade in your landscape, you're certainly going to want to source things that tolerate the shade as opposed to full sun. Now, when we say full sun, and you can often find these descriptions when you're investigating seed packets or seed catalogs, they'll often have these descriptions in there. But full sun often means at least 3 to 4 hours of high light. Sometimes you'll need a little bit more of that, but that's at least that kind of average when it comes to those full sun crops. which most of these are roses on the right corner, sometimes will tolerate low light, but sometimes will not set enough flowers in low light. So they will survive, they will tolerate sometimes shade, but they won't set an abundant amount of flowers. So when it comes to survival rates, growth habits, you will often see plants that want a little bit more sun when you're not getting a lot of flowers. And we're going to be talking about tomatoes coming up, and that's a good kind of example of that beyond just pruning. We've got sage up here, really nice hardy perennial. We've got the aster family. These are daisies. Cleome right here. It's a great plant. Tiger lily in the middle. And this is breadseed poppy. Absolutely gorgeous. I think that's Hungarian blue and certainly digitalis. That grows very well. But be aware that that is a biennial. So if you buy it first year, you'll only get the vegetation. The second year is when it flowers. So sometimes you can find things that have already gotten that vernalization or cold treatment to flower immediately for you. Now, tools. Now, over here on the left is a few of my favorite garden tools. It certainly goes beyond this, but this time of year, we're always thinking on our soil quality, our planting areas, and this certainly goes beyond where we're planting in pots or trays to germinate and sow. When it comes to your landscape, the easiest thing to determine sometimes is to literally test your soil. Now, these pH meters, this black one here is one of my favorites, and it's a bit of an investment. I like Hannah as the company. You can find various meters like this or just litmus paper to test your pH. And then to get more and more familiar with pH, there are these charts here that allow you to see what's available at certain pH levels. Now, most plants will tolerate between a 5.8 and a 6.2 with a few exceptions. So that's kind of that middle range around what's neutral, which is 7, okay, just below that neutral point. It gets a lot more complicated than that with organic chemistry, but I'm not going to really dive into that. In the industry, we always kind of separate plants into the geranium group here and the petunia group. Geranium group plants like alkaline soils, so high pH, and the petunia group are the acidic types of plants. And sometimes we'll put them into those kind of common language just categories. So hand lenses, invest in or a jeweler's loupe, they're often called. I like the plastic versions. You break it, you know, no big deal. Inexpensive. Sometimes they have light, sometimes not. And of course, a good pair of pruners. Okay, so this time of year, we're always thinking, should we put manure down? Should we put compost down? It's always good to test your soil. UNH used to have at least a few categories of testing, even heavy metal testing. I believe they're still doing it. You might as well double check. UMass is another place, Cornell if you want to send it out, but sometimes you want a full spectrum analysis because sometimes your nitrogen, for instance, is too rich and you don't want to put compost down. You don't want to put certain nitrogen aspects of amendments down. So you just want to know what's going on in your soil as opposed to just putting amendments down every year without knowing the chemistry of your soil. It could be good already. Just consider that. So lights, certainly you can grow under lights inside. Coming up is kind of two categories of whether you should direct sow or transplant your plants. This time of year, a lot of people will grow under lights to grow out their plants before planting, especially here in New England. New England's season is so short that it's really beneficial to grow out very warm loving plants. Like melons, for instance, pumpkins, sweet melons, or hardy melons. They need a long period of time to grow. So it will be beneficial to grow it out a little bit early this time of year inside. So when you're bringing things out, you almost want to see flowers already set on some of your transplants, and that'll give you fruit a lot earlier than direct sow or planting something very, very small. So just consider that with lights. These lights are pink. It's a bit of that spectrum with a lot of LED lights that are coming out now. Really, really innovative designs. Almost every day there's something new as opposed to white light. Perlite, vermiculite, these are a few amendments that you could consider. Vermiculite's got a little clay in it, so it does absorb a little bit of moisture as opposed to perlite, which is really kind of an aeration aspect of amending your soils. You can do this during germination for your seeds, and you can do it in your gardens outside. A lot of people don't like the look of perlite in the gardens. It will kind of glow. So this is often a good way to aerate your germination trays or creating your own mixes, definitely with germination because you want a lot of air in those cells or those trays. Or sometimes I'll recycle cups and all sorts of things to germinate in, from plastic to paper. Egg cartons, for instance. For a while, I was doing that in those plastic type egg cartons, which worked well. Compost, developing compost systems on your site, your house, your garden is essential for just adding nutrients when you need it. So consider that at home. Compost science is wicked cool. Now, this is a bit of a division between transplants and direct sow. Now, everyone's got their own opinion on this. These are just my preferences. So on the left is what I often transplant, just a few examples. So these are the things I'm growing out inside and bringing them out often. I'd say from a 3-inch pot to a 4-inch pot is an excellent transplant. You can go smaller than that, but you definitely want a few inches of root system before you're bringing things out. We often explain a transplant is ready when it has at least 2 to 3 true leaves. So when those real leaves develop beyond those small cotyledons, those little tiny leaves that develop right past germination, you develop the real leaves. You want at least 2 to 3 of those for a good transplant to come outside, but it all depends on where you live and what region. Really quickly, Portsmouth, the Seacoast here is a 5A. So if you're looking at seeds, if you're deciding what to grow, that's our current zone 5A, and you'll often find those little categories on seed packets and catalogs as well if you're determining what will grow best here in New England at least. On the right here, this is direct sow, so from carrots to turnip to kale. Microgreens, certainly growing things small works great with direct sow. Lots of greens, lettuces, and other types of greens. Microgreen just means growing things very small. One of my favorite heirlooms that we grow is Orac lettuce, and that really works nicely as a microgreen, although it's not green, it's purple. It's got a salty, sweet flavor to it. It's really, really good. So just consider those 2 categories and experiment. The best lessons we can possibly learn in the garden is making mistakes. So don't worry so much. It's all fun, right? So this is our colonial garden, just to give you kind of a view on some of our designs here with a few historical pictures. On the right is an old picture of Sherburne Garden. This is interpreted to around 1695, and it's a very, very wild. The purple red, that's the Orac I was just telling you about, and that's going to seed when it's that tall. And that's calendula just below, really easy to grow, edible flowers, and that was used as a peppercorn substitute early on when peppercorn was so expensive. So if you haven't seen Sherburne in full bloom, full flower, check it out. It's a beautiful, beautiful historical garden. We grow quite a lot of beans. So beans can be sowed before the last frost, but most people won't plant that early. So that's coming up pretty soon. One of the first things that will direct sow. So I prefer direct sow for beans, and there's quite a few different ones. This is cranberry bean, one of our oldest heirlooms that we cultivate. This is Victory Garden, which we interpret around 1943. Now, a lot of people are revisiting the Victory Garden era where subsistence was, brought back during wartime efforts when people were planting as much as possible. And more people are revisiting this philosophy when it comes to just growing as much produce as possible. So connecting to this era, connecting to a lot of the heirlooms at that time, in here we do cabbage and kale and turnips and tomatoes. We do nasturtium, plenty of flowers to bring in the pollinators. So do consider putting flowers around your veggies. As those pollinators come in more and more for those flowers, they will visit the veggies. So with more flowers comes more pollinators. With more pollinators comes more food. Okay, so it's all that symbiosis with our native pollinators, our honeybees, and just that diversity, which would be significant when it comes to producing as much food as possible. And you can see no inch is empty. So at that time and still today, we really approach filling in our gardens as much as possible. And that'll certainly keep some of the weeds out as well. Some people will put really wide rows to walk between. It's very convenient, but that's where the weeds come in, with that compaction as we walk through our rows. Just consider different methods, different approach. This is a little 2D kind of bird's eye view of a previous design of Victory Garden. So to give you a few impressions on what we do grow here, there's garlic rows. We used to grow strawberries down here in the Vicuñas plot, which was a house. This is where we grow all the flowers, mostly with a few herbs. Now, herbs will tolerate shade a lot better than some veggies, with a few exceptions. So do consider kind of hiding and tucking a few things in that don't require a lot of room. Like thyme, for instance, that will come back in this area and does not need a lot of room. And when we're harvesting, we just need a little bit. It goes a long way. We do have a few perennial beds of asparagus at the top here. That's still active. Arugula, lots of microgreens with that. Succession planting, again, planting the same thing over and over again. Arugula works great. I grow that and sometimes complement it with watermelon. That combination, spicy and sweet, is amazing. And you can see a few yucca over here, which is edible, but for a long time it was an ornamental plant and used for natural cordage. The leaves can be made into rope. And I've trellised tomatoes before with natural yucca rope. It's very fun. Few examples. This is the orac I just mentioned, absolutely delicious, often called salt bush because it's salty, sweet flavor. Certainly kale, very hardy. You can direct sow kale or transplant it. There's a few varieties from Russian kale to dinosaur kale. We grow 4 or 5 different types sometimes. Lovage down here, if you like celery, is a great perennial for this area. Will certainly benefit some native pollinators as well. And it's used kind of like a bay leaf in soups and stews. It imparts a really strong celery flavor. And if you like cocktails, some people use the stem as a straw, maybe a little Bloody Mary, or other mocktails would certainly work as well. Beets are great, and you can do succession planting with beet. Of course, we're often after that nice, delicious root, but you can also eat the foliage. So do consider plants that you can eat the different parts. The shoot is edible, the leaves are edible, the root is edible, and you can plant that several times in one season to get at least 3 to 5 different crops. And last but not least, the Boothby's blonde cucumber. Unlike a lot of our cucumbers we're familiar with, we harvest it yellow, and it's just amazing. Really, really quick to grow compared to other varieties. And if it does go pretty tough on you, you just haven't caught it, you can roast it like a zucchini. It's just really, really good. So a lot of information on here, but the main kind of point is growing is knowing. So just going through practice, you'll get more and more familiar. And plants are just like people. You get to know them a little bit and you know what they need. Tomatoes need things that, let's say, brassicas don't need. So just getting more and more familiar. So these are different themes that you can approach designs with, from urban designs to rural designs, pocket gardening. Maybe you don't have a yard and you want to plant in pots. We use quite a lot of clay pots during season to move around. You can grow quite a few things in pots. Maybe you just have a patio and you don't actually have access to soil. You can grow microgreens in pots. You can grow tomatoes. You can grow radish, turnips, all sorts of things without an actual garden. And then a lot of people will work their way up to more dynamic, sustainable systems, from permaculture to other more systematic aspects of horticulture, but kind of a work in progress, year after year, developing those types of systems. We're going to go through a few of these topics in a little bit more detail, from germination to transplanting, and certainly pest management as we go through these slides. Soil is everything. We just talked a little bit about nutrients and testing your soil. It's not often practical to just assume what's in there. So testing, maybe from basic tests to every now and then maybe sending off a soil sample and seeing what our university would say, giving you all sorts of information to then decide how you amend your soil and what you do in your soil to benefit your plants. We are so concentrated on what's happening above the ground, we sometimes forget the magic is below. So this has to do with testing and getting more and more familiar on what we're really doing. We're not really growing plants because plants grow themselves. We're growing soil, okay? We're benefiting the microorganisms, from fungi to bacteria to different arthropods, and all sorts of interactions, and certainly with the top layer as well, with birds and bees and butterflies. So just consider it is a whole system when you are garden designing. Now on the left here is comfrey, a very unique plant. It grows very well in this environment, this climate. Comfrey was often used to plant at the base of trees to aerate their root systems. Now, this is a great pollinator plant. So if you want to bring in pollinators, this is a good one. I believe it comes in mostly purple these days, but sometimes you can find it in white. It's got quite the root system, but be aware, once you plant it, you'll never get rid of it. It's like horseradish, it kind of sticks around. So plant growth and life cycles, it's again, a little, it's clever just to get more and more familiar with the things that you like to grow, things you like to plant and cultivate. This is just a very unique picture of an old seed catalog. Again, just getting familiar with different heirlooms. We like to plant the same plant, but different varieties of the same plant. So if you like tomatoes, maybe consider growing lots of different tomatoes. If you're worried about them crossing, they will, but often at home, we're just kind of focused on producing food for ourselves. And enhancing our dinner tables, just tables in general. So just consider just growing different varieties of the same type of plant, different flavors, all sorts of different colors and textures. This is one of the arugula crops I mentioned we do succession planting with. And behind here, oh, sorry, that's a little elderberry back in the corner there. This is also our asparagus bed, but this is later in the season. We'll see that asparagus coming up in about a month. So sometimes when you think of a garden design, I often think of theming it around, maybe it's culinary, maybe you like to eat something, maybe you like to cook something. I love savory dishes, so I'm often focused on growing savory spices and things that complement fish and meat, seafood dishes, stews and soups, crock pot recipes. So I often think of the seasonality and start with the landscape and what's available, but what's available depends on what we're designing, what we're growing. So do consider how you approach your designs. Red sauce, for instance. I mean, there's so many different things that go into red sauce that we could literally grow in our gardens to certainly enhance our own recipes. So just consider that kind of approach when it comes to themes. It could be medicinal, could be just beautiful. So it's just unique to just kind of go through those different themes. A few examples of the few things that we do cultivate, very unique stuff, especially the wintergreen. This is a native plant that grows in the forest ecosystems, but you can cultivate it on your own. And yes, this is the flavor of wintergreen gum amongst many, many other products that has that minty flavor. It looks poisonous when you come across it in the wild because of that red color. Lots of things that are red are poisonous, but this is perfectly edible. Leaves and the fruit. I like to just chew on the fruit. They're absolutely delicious and will complement ice cream and other sweet dishes. Lemongrass will work here, but it is very difficult to overwinter in gardens. We've tried that a few times, even overwintering in the greenhouse. A little tricky. I would love to successfully do that one year. So lemongrass is what citronella candles originate from. So that's the original ingredient for insecticidal properties. From candles to all sorts of products. Lemongrass is kind of the initial start point. Fennel is great. Hot peppers in this area are great. If you're starting your seed, peppers are the one thing you want to start before anything. They take a long time, even when growing inside. So the one thing, peppers, onion sets, a few things you really want to start before anything else because of their time that they need. And that would be, again, a transplant. Black peppercorn is a vine, probably the most challenging thing on this list, on this slide to grow. It will grow inside, but it really likes very, very hot environments in its original environment in Asia. Lavender, again, a transplant. Once you establish it in New England, it really loves sandy soil. So do consider that. You don't want it to have what we say wet feet. It does not like a lot of water. So do consider that. And that's why we usually have to transplant, because it usually will dampen off or rot out in the germination phase. Very, very tricky to germinate or propagate. A few others, I think I mentioned this before, but do consider plants that have multiple parts that you can eat. Like dill, for instance, seeds are edible, flowers are edible, foliage is edible, stems when they're young are edible. So do consider multiple parts. Rosemary flowers are one of my favorite things of all time. And a lot of people won't age their rosemaries or they won't survive long enough to start flowering. So normally older rosemary plants, if you bring them inside every year and plant them in the garden and just kind of keep it going sustainably, they will eventually flower on you. And they are absolutely delicious, these flowers. I can just pick at them and eat them or sprinkle them over something delicious. Really, really nice. Roots as well. So do consider a few things. Cardamom is in the greenhouse. You can grow that as a house plant. I haven't tried turmeric yet, but you can cultivate root crops as well. Planting them in pots to overwinter and bringing them back out to the landscape. There's a few ways you can do that. And last but not least, one of my favorite, that's Meyer lemon, which is in the greenhouse, setting fruit right now. Certainly garlic, parsley, summer savory, bay leaf is also another one that we put in the greenhouse and then bring back out. So do consider houseplants that you could plant in your landscape, in your garden during season, but then bringing them back in will allow you to really sustain these ingredients year after year, but a lot of them will not make it through our winter, okay? Tarragon is a nice hardy perennial that will make it through the winter, comes up every year, and I really like to plant that nice and full and tight, just like coriander. Sometimes wispy aspects, growth habits, you really want to plant a lot of them so they kind of lean against each other, okay? This is a salad I put together a few years ago with ground cherry. Do consider ground cherry, which is the yellow fruit here. Grows very well. And this is something that you can eat all season long. And it's even sweeter in early winter because once it gets kind of shocked with a cold treatment, it's absolutely delicious. It's just night and day how those sugars kind of move through the plant or kind of evolve in the fruit. So ground cherry, they actually drop to the ground, become almost translucent they look like little tomatillos. and inside the hull are these fruits. Absolutely delicious. So we have some edible flowers of fennel in there, some cabbage, a few other things with just a simple vinaigrette. Really good. This is the diversity in the herb garden. So you can really pack in a lot of diversity into your designs. I would not recommend this much. In the initial design, I think we put in a little bit too much. So now everything's kind of running in together. Don't get me wrong, I love diversity. But as kind of a teaching garden, it's really tough for visitors to kind of, the difference between that plant and that, because it's just so lush. But you can see a few examples. We've separated it out to teach kind of the origins of plant. From Asia plants, we've got Africa here, Eastern and Western Europe, we've got our Native American plants where we have bloodroot, for instance. If you've never grown bloodroot and you really want early color, that's probably one of the first things we see. It's growing right here in the corner, and we've got it maybe in one or two other locations, but it emerges pretty quickly and has these absolutely beautiful white flowers, but they're gone in maybe like a week. It's really quick, but one of the earliest things that comes up with crocus, hyacinth, a few other things. You can find this online on our website, this map. Hopefully we have a few examples of this, I believe. A few other things. Certainly I concentrate on a lot of spices for pickling, cucumbers, amongst other things, like the sage we mentioned before. The dill is actually preservative, so awesome flavor, and it preserves food. That's why it's often in pickling recipes, other preservation recipes. Allspice, as tricky as peppercorn, coriander, awesome in this area. And you can grow ginger, but it's extremely slow. But give it a try. There is a ginger lily that's a little bit more ornamental, but it's not the same as what we buy in the grocery stores. Crocus we've did before, but unsuccessfully. We have a lot of pests. If you have rabbits, if you have squirrels, if you have these little critters digging in your gardens, crocus is a little tricky amongst other herbs. They will eat them. This is the very valuable saffron crocus. Probably the biggest installation of saffron crocus is in Pennsylvania. Otherwise, it's coming, it's imported, I believe. Tips to harvest. Sometimes we don't want to just dig out the entire plant. Sometimes we just need a few leaves to flavor a salad or a soup. On the left here, for instance, is sorrel, which works out tremendous in this area, very hardy, commonly known as lemon leaf. These leaves taste like lemon, and they're absolutely delicious and really good for us. You can make a soup with it or a salad mixed with other greens. Really, really nice. This grows in a few locations, and tarragon as well on the right. Sometimes we'll just cut little pieces off and it'll actually bunch out on you. So I'm going to talk a little bit coming up on apical dominance, but the simpler explanation is cutting the top of a plant will often make it wider and bushier. Okay, so you can kind of play with those methods with a few different plants, but essentially you're taking the tips off, utilizing just the, top, and that'll allow a lot of the leaves to break out below those tips once you remove them. But I've got a chart coming up that explains that. Here we go. So apical bud on the top, if you remove that, these dormant lateral buds will start growing more. So you can manipulate quite a lot of plants to grow in certain ways by taking that apical dominance out, okay? Now, thank you so much for all the preliminary questions that came in before this talk, because I worked a few of these slides in with those questions, and someone was curious about pruning tomatoes, which is an excellent question. Once you learn this, you'll certainly get a lot more tomatoes. So on the left here is what we call a sucker, okay? You can see this flower set above on a terminal branch here, but you'll often get a lot of these suckers. You want to remove most of these, okay? And that will allow a lot of the energy to keep going to those terminals where the flowers are setting, where you want the fruit, okay? So just practicing that, looking for those signals, removing a lot of the vegetation, and sometimes just removing leaves as well, will allow you to donate a lot more energy to those fruit sets. Some people will grow tomatoes and they're curious on why it's just all leaves. It's because they're not pruning, okay? Pruning will also allow light to penetrate the canopy, and light and fruit set are hand in hand. So light will also give you more fruit as well, but if you continually vegetate your plants, not much light penetrates and you will notice not a lot of fruit, okay? IPM, integrated pest management, is just a fancy way of saying that we integrate different methods. We don't just spray when there's a problem, okay? There are all sorts of different methods to do as opposed to just spraying when you have a problem. This has to do with, you know, how much nitrogen is in your soil. This has to do with light quality, water management, all sorts of variables to integrate into your own home systems, okay? This is passion flower on the right, one of my favorites. Now, this is a simple way to explain integrated pest management. Disease in the center can be smaller or larger depending on these outside variables. So if your environment is too wet, your disease is going to increase. If you're planting a host plant for a disease, let's say gooseberry. Hopefully everyone's familiar with gooseberry, which is a host of white pine blister rust in this area. Now you have to actually register when you grow or buy gooseberry because the state wants to know that you're only growing resistant varieties, okay? So some things will host those diseases, but a lot of people are developing the same species, but resistant to the disease, okay? And then pathogens, a little tricky. Disease is caused by a pathogen. So powdery mildew is not a pathogen, it's a disease, okay? So fungi will create different diseases. So that's just a basic representation of integrated pest management. Biological controls, some are native to this area. Some things will be flying around very soon as temperature increases. In fact, upper left here, a lot of people think that is a scary pest. That is a lady beetle, okay? Which is this is adult, okay? This is kind of a teenager, okay? So a lot of people see that in the garden and they think it's something that they don't want. That is a lady beetle, and it will kind of metamorphose into an adult. This is another kind of scary thing to see, especially if you're growing tomatoes, okay? This is a parasitic wasp that attacks, this is the same wasp here, that attacks tomato horn worm. So big worms that you'll often just remove and kind of toss into a jar if you've got the courage. They blend in quite a bit, but sometimes you'll find them with all these eggs. Do not remove this one because each of these eggs will be a parasitic wasp that emerges and then just starts taking care of your garden. This is a native wasp. There are native lady beetles, but many of them are introduced from Asia. Okay.
And Eric, I think if we're going to have time to answer questions, maybe wrap up with this slide.
Sure. So this is just kind of explaining different pressures just to get more and more familiar. Environmental pressures, mechanical, biological would be those pests, but I can just kind of quickly go through. Let's just dive into questions. I love just getting questions, and I can only assume what you want to learn, so fire away.
All right, and I invite everybody who has a question to type them into chat, and those will come directly to me, and I'll present them to Eric, and we'll get through as many as we possibly can. To start out with, we have a question about row covers. Do we use them at Strawberry Bank for pest control, and would you recommend them in a home setting?
I would recommend them in a heartbeat, but we often don't utilize a lot of row covers because of our desire to repeat what people would have done historically. So it is kind of a modern, they would have probably done it in the early 20th century. It wasn't like the material that we have today, that remay type. But they were, even earlier in the colonial period, they were putting things over their crops and fumigating certain things. Let's say tobacco was one of the earliest types of burn methods for pest management, where they were literally burning tobacco underneath the cover, but it could have been like just a wool cover, a basic textile cover, as opposed to these modern materials. So I would recommend it, but we don't often display these modern types of innovations when it comes to our interpretations. But works great as barriers. Even for birds, birds picking at raspberries or blueberries. A lot of farmers, and there's different layers, different thickness. So again, you definitely want light to still penetrate. People use plastics as well, but I don't like to recommend plastics very much.
And we left off on your pest slide, but people are very interested if you have any tips on moles, controlling mole populations.
Moles. So a lot of people will use bombs. I don't recommend bombs, which are basically underground fumigants that basically smoke moles out. Soil quality is one. They tend to want to be in compacted soils that aren't very diverse. I always recommend people having cats with gardens. Our old cat, unfortunately, who passed away a few years ago, JD, missed that little fellow, would take care of a lot of our pests, voles, mice, even live rabbits. He'd be walking around with a live rabbit in his mouth. But yeah, a lot of turf companies will recommend chemical treatments and all those aggressive aspects. But I really think it's more to do with developing kind of a succession of your soils and the health of your turf. They seem to want to be in disturbed areas, like compacted areas, with a few exceptions. But a lot of people will, use these injection methods directly into where they're living in the soil. Voles, moles, we have a lot of voles. So it's kind of like a mole, but blind.
And Eric, I was wondering if you would mind stop share on the slide so that the
Sure.
guests can see you better as you answer these questions. Thank you so much. There's also a lot of interest in deer populations and keeping deer from eating your plants. Specifically, somebody asked if lavender is a good solution, and if so, when should they plant it? Will that deter the deer?
It's not going to deter deer. They probably won't eat the lavender itself, but there's a lot of these ideas of, if deer are hungry enough, they're going to eat anything. There are a few exceptions where they're just going to kind of stay away from a few things, but there's a lot of marketing around deer resistant plants, but there's a certain stage where, if resources are so limited, they're going to eat whatever they can find, from bulbs like hosta to certainly veggies to grasses, all sorts of things. I actually recommend barriers for deer and pests a lot, from rabbit to groundhog to deer. Not a lot of people can afford fencing when it comes to their gardens, but one of the cheapest ways I started to keep pests out of my old house's garden is electric wire, with a really, really inexpensive line. It's just basically at, head level for groundhogs and a little bit higher for deer, but sometimes they'll jump right over that. So it's very tricky. If your garden abuts a woodland area, that ecology and that habitat just kind of, it's for deer, but they are kind of forced into the forest. They want to be out in the grass. They want to be outside the forest. We kind of pressured them in there, including all sorts of different species. So yeah, barriers certainly work, but you might just kind of consider an experiment, but I don't think the lavender is going to keep them out. especially at the height of a lavender. There are varieties that are a little taller, but sometimes barriers that are just a little bit taller than some varieties will allow them to walk in certain areas or hang out in other areas. But, and I don't recommend any chemical treatments. A lot of people are experimenting with like animal urines. But I don't really even know if that works. Just kind of sounds nasty in the garden, especially around food crops, like predator urine.
What are your feelings on raised garden beds over black cloth if you have a soil with an invasive species?
So you want, if you're trying to get rid of, raised beds are awesome because you can basically design your own soil, your own cultivation, even on bedrock. If you're trying to get rid of invasive species, tarps, things that allow water to penetrate, a lot of these weed barriers do work. But with a raised bed system, you also want to consider what is in your native soils, like let's say worms, for instance. So there are a few ways, but with invasive species, smothering invasive species like that is probably one of the easiest organic measures to do without having to spray a bunch of Roundup, which we don't do, right? We don't want to do that, especially around our food crops. But do consider also the benefit of native soil and native organisms coming up into your raised bed, So for invasive species, absolutely to take care of that, but do consider, the pathway between what you design on top and those interactions with native soil, native chemistry, and all that good stuff that's already in our soils, including minerals that are often really difficult to produce in a raised bed beyond the just, hundreds and hundreds of years of accumulating in our native soils. It's a good question.
Erik, one of your first slides, you were showing different magnifying tools, pruners, soil meters. Can you talk about why you'd want something like a magnifying glass in the gardens, why that's an important tool?
Absolutely. So I have that example right here next to me. And there are a few examples. So this is the easiest tool to use when scouting pests. And we often call this a jeweler's loop. A true jeweler's loop is metal and a little bit smaller than this. Sometimes they're double lens like this, which gives you a little bit more magnification. I usually try to do a 30 times 30x, but I literally walk around with these things in my pocket. And, over the years, I've been able to see exactly where these insects are. And it just takes practice to know the signals and symptoms of pests and diseases, but using this will allow you to ID certain pests. So when we go into a garden center and we're looking for, let's say, an organic pesticide like pyrethrum, which is one of the strongest aspects of organic pest management, it's often giving us certain insects that it's going to target. But if we don't know what insects are on our plants, we don't really know what the appropriate chemical is or the appropriate chemistry for those treatments for pest management. So the one thing you want to do is ID the problem first with these little hand lenses. Now, you want to get familiar with where certain insects hide, like spider mites will always be on the underside of the leaf, with exception, when it gets really bad, you can literally see webbing like a spider. But if it's gotten that bad, it's too late. So underside of leaf for spider mites, in the cracks and nooks for mealybugs, but this allows you to ID the pests. You could have a yellow dying plant, but looking a little bit closer will allow you to ID the actual pest or problem. These work as well under the soil. So do consider there are pests underneath the soil as well, like fungus gnat larvae. Fungus gnats will often be those little buzzy insects above the soil surface. They look like little tiny gnats. Sometimes shore flies also, but those are usually eating the algae. But fungus gnats, their larvae will be underneath about an inch of the soil. So sometimes you'll peel things back little closer, but again, it's all about IDing the problem and then deciding what needs to be done.
And Eric, can you recommend any garden planning programs, any like software, specifically to do a layout and design of your garden? We're particularly interested in that if you know of any free options.
Most of them are not free, unfortunately. If you want a very inexpensive aspect, well, we have used Adobe software for many years. And you can do like old versions, but most of it's paid, like a monthly. A lot of the new Adobe software is like a monthly paid basis, if I remember correctly. But yes, the maps that I showed you guys, I believe, let's say Victory Garden, that was done with an Adobe software. You can get really basic. They probably have 2D free software. I'm just not familiar. It's a good question. But we've used Adobe for many years. It's just an old version that we purchased at least 10 years ago that we've been using more and more, but we are ready for the next step to really represent our designs a little bit more professionally.
And Eric, do you have any tips or tricks people could use to keep a garden continuously blooming through the seasons? What do we do at Strawberry Bank to always have something beautiful for the visitors to look at?
So that's a great question. So you would kind of approach this as that seasonality again. So for instance, the first things that are coming up usually this time of year are often planted in the fall, let's say bulbs, or sometimes perennials if you have some time in the fall. So this is last year. So hyacinth and tulips, eventually the lilies, and just all sorts of things that emerge first are often planted the year before. So when it comes to planting, sometimes it's often months and months ahead to at least know that things are going to start in the very early spring, and then they're going to lead into some later perennials, but then you get into what you're actually planting in the spring. So you're eventually by, late May, June, you're putting in transplants, depending on your region where you are, but usually it's early June that we're putting most of our transplants in. And those are the plants, again, that have been growing for at least a month, maybe 2 months inside, sometimes under light, sometimes not. Succession planting, again, planting the same thing over and over again could work as well. But a whole season is really to basically concentrate on early spring, early summer, late summer, plants that grow well in those little windows, all the way into winter, these very hardy varieties. And some fruit will actually develop into the winter, like winter pears. Winter pears are something you don't want to eat when it's warm out. You grab it, it looks delicious, and it's hard as a rock. But a lot of those fruits that we often are commonly eating during season, just a little cold treatment, you can always just like wrap them in paper and store them in cold storage, and they're going to be delicious in the winter. So it's just kind of that long-term effort of getting familiar with what's growing first thing, what's growing after that. We often concentrate on that really warm season, June to, let's say, August into October. That's the main kind of growing season for New England. But there's always these, windows on either side. And just considering growing a lot of diversity in different types of plants will allow you to see different flowers coming out, different fruits, on and on, especially those root crops that will allow you to grow right into the winter. When it comes to row covers and remay, you can get things really far into the winter, like lettuces, cabbage, kale. Many things will be very hardy with a little insulation and a little bit of innovation beyond those typical ways of growing in the soil. I hope I answered that. I can go on and on about succession planting.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. But first, I did want to mention that One of you said that Farmer's Almanac offers free software for garden planning. So if you're interested in that, check out the Farmer's Almanac webpage.
Cool.
And our final question, Eric, do you have any fertilizer recommendations, safe recommendations? And people seem particularly interested in this if you're gardening near water and that concern about runoff into the water. What can you use safely?
So there's a lot of organic, commercially available fertilizers. I tend to go to Agway a lot, certainly for chicken food and soil and fertilizer. Compost is my favorite, but you have to really be aware and familiar on how it's being made. Not a lot of compost you buy gives you kind of like a full spectrum analysis of what's in it. Just says organic compost, and we get excited, but we don't really know what's in it. You can test what you buy, but a little tricky. But I often will recommend sourcing from a local farm, doing it right. Compost takes at least 3 years to complete unless you have a really large installation. Beyond that, one of the brands I use is Espoma. If you're familiar, everyone, that's a pretty well-known brand. You can buy them in very small bags, and they were often themed for roses or azalea or different. They'll often have kind of a theme to them. There's tomato mixtures. I would recommend utilizing those types of organic brands because creating your own fertilizers is very difficult. And people often just kind of overdo the nitrogen a little bit. And then you certainly have problems like aphids and all sorts of different things. What else can I recommend? Again, compost is my favorite. Slow release nitrogen is also really good because a lot of these liquid varieties just put it down too quickly. And you really want to concentrate more on like a balance between nitrate nitrogen and ammonium nitrogen. Okay. I wish I had time to go into organic chemistry. It's so interesting. But there's always that balance. But read your labels very carefully and take the recommendations of application rate with a grain of salt. Okay. It's like cooking. Once you put it in, it's really hard to take it back out. So you can always a little bit at a time. And that's why I like compost, finished, very rich compost, because it is slow release and it's giving you more than, those basic nutrients of, NPK, macronutrients, all sorts of things, including fungi and bacteria. So it's a wide spectrum, not just the salts that we have in mind, which is, those typical micronutrients. It's a good question. I hope I answered it.
All right, well, thank you so much, Eric, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I did want to mention before you go that our next virtual program is on March 25th at 7 p.m. It's Behind the Curtain, Strawberry Bank Revealed. And it's a live program. There'll be firsthand stories from staff members, donors, business sponsors, volunteers, all talking about Strawberry Bank Museum. There'll be trivia questions and a raffle to win a lifetime membership at Strawberry Bank worth $12,000. And you can register for that on our website, strawberrybank.org. I hope to see you all there. And again, thank you all for coming, and I hope you all have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Great job.
No, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.